Hi, this is Sean D'Souza from psychotactics.com, and you're listening to the 3-Month Vacation Podcast. This podcast isn't some magic trick about working less. Instead, it's about how to really enjoy your work and enjoy your vacation time. This is the 3-Month Vacation. I'm Sean D'Souza. Imagine you're the athlete that's trying for the gold medal at the high jump at the Olympics, and you're reading the newspaper, and you read the first newspaper, and it's the Los Angeles Times, and they're saying, oh, that athlete, he goes over the bar like a guy being pushed out of a 30-story window. So you pick up the next newspaper, and it's The Guardian, and The Guardian says, you are the curiosity of the team. It's calling you the curiosity of the team. And then you pick up the magazine Sports Illustrated, and it says, he charges up from slightly to the left of center with a gait that may call to mind a two-legged camel. We're talking about Dick Fosbury here. The guy who first did the Fosbury flop. And it's not like Dick Fosbury was arguing with their comments, because at college someone bet him that he couldn't get over a leather chair. He couldn't jump over that leather chair. And he said he tried, but not only did he lose his bet, but he also broke his hand in the crash landing. In 1968, when he arrived at the Mexico Olympics, he was relatively unknown. And yet days later, he not only captured the imagination of the Mexican public, but also the rest of the world. He sailed over the bar at 2.24 meters, which is 7 feet and 4 inches. But it wasn't that he sailed over, because that wasn't the world record. It's that he did it by overcoming the obstacle with his crazy jump, which was called the Fosbury flop. Now, what's interesting about the Fosbury flop is that no one ever did that kind of flop before. No one ever tried to get over the bar in that manner. It was considered extremely weird, extremely camel-like. And yet today, it's extremely weird to see people jumping over the bar as they did back in 1968. Today, the Fosbury flop is the way people jump over a bar at the Olympics, in any sports stadium. What Fosbury did was, he looked at the obstacle and he said, let me get over this another way, because there's no way I'm going to be able to do it the usual way. And that's really what this podcast is all about. We're going to look at writing and why we struggle with writing, why we have these obstacles with writing, because if we go about it the way we've always done, that doesn't seem to work for us, because you're going about it the same way that I used to do back in the year 2000, where I would look at the article and then try to write it, and then spend 2 days writing that article and getting very frustrated and not knowing what was going wrong. And so we have to look at the obstacle, that bar, and look at how we can get over that bar in a completely different way. And that's what this podcast is going to cover. We're going to cover 3 things. The first thing is about editing. The second thing is about preparation. And the third is about the one word or the one term. As always, we'll start with the first, which is editing. I love making a rice dish called biryani. It is a dish meant for kings. It has all of these yummy elements, and if you've ever eaten a biryani, you know exactly what I mean. But here's how you go about making a biryani. You have to get all the things together, like spices and the yogurt, and other stuff like saffron and ghee, which is a clarified butter. And when you get all of those things together, you cut some onions. In fact, you cut a lot of onions, and then you caramelize the onions. And when all of that is done, you marinate it. A few hours later, it's time to cook the biryani. I put it all in a dish which we call handi. You would call it a saucepan. But before I turn on the flame, I have to do one very important thing. I have to seal the handi or the saucepan with dough, so that it becomes like a pressure cooker, and the meat cooks in it, and the rice cooks in it, and all the flavors cook within it, and it's all sealed. You can't get in. So, did you notice the problem? Sure you did. It was the dough. It sealed the vessel. There is no way to know whether the rice is cooked or the chicken is still raw. The dough prevents me from editing. And editing is the first big obstacle to writing. Why? Because the writer and the editor are two completely different people.
How close will we come to the nearest Klingon outpost if we continue on our present course?
1 parsec, sir. Close enough to smell them.
That is illogical, Ensign. Odors cannot travel through the vacuum of space.
The writer is like Captain Kirk. You watched Star Trek, didn't you? Well, the writer is like Captain Kirk, and Captain Kirk has all these great ideas. He wants to go where no man has ever gone before, and he's a bit out there. And then you have Spock. And he needs to be logical, and that's how your editor acts every single time. So we have these two people, two completely different people, and they're at loggerheads with each other. And what we do when we write is we put both of those people on the same seat. Of course they're going to fight. Of course they're going to continuously argue with each other. And of course, that's your obstacle, isn't it? You're not going to get over that obstacle because you're treating both of them as the same person when they're completely different. So the first thing you've got to realize is that it's not Captain Spock, it's Captain Kirk and Mr. Spock. You've got to start out with the writing process and then let it marinate. And several hours later, you have to bring in Mr. Spock. Just like the biryani, you've got to let that marination process take its own sweet time. So you probably want to write at one part of the day and then want to look at it maybe later in the day or even the next day. And this is what I had to do when I first started out. I was not very good at writing. I was not very quick at writing. So I would send my article to a friend and a client whose name is Chris Ellington, and Chris would look over it and then fix it. And he had a million fixes. And then it would come back and then I would send it out again, this time to Rochelle, and Rochelle would look at all the grammar and fix it. And all of this editing process would drive me absolutely crazy. Plus there was my own creative output, as it were. But this is the process. There is the writer and the editor. And there is this time in between. And what we do is we make a Captain Spock out of it. And of course it doesn't work, and there is no reason why it should work, because editing and writing just do not mix. So that's our first great obstacle, and we have to learn that we're going to have to do things differently, do a bit of a Fosbury flop if we want to get over that bar and write great content. And this takes us to the second one. And the second one is all about preparation. On June 29, 2007, Pixar released a movie about a rat, and it was called Ratatouille. It was a story about an aspiring chef called Linguini and a rat called Remy, a rat that loved to cook.
Animation is a very, very complicated business. There's hundreds of people involved in the actual production.
So many things that we take for granted in real life are difficult to do in the computer.
Pixar is really very good at addressing complex problems.
By far, this is the most complicated clothing that we've done.
We went through a special sequence on that with a character, with Linguini jumps into the Seine to try and save Remy. He comes out dripping wet, and we had to try and figure out a way to get that look when cloth sticks to the skin and you can see just a little bit of color coming through.
And so what do? We abuse one of our poor coworkers. We make him dress up in a chef's outfit. We douse him with water and we film it. What does it look like? Where on the clothing can you see through to his skin? Where do the drips come off of his face? It's kind of our excuse to abuse coworkers, actually, now I think about it.
What you just heard in that clip is preparation, preparation, and more preparation. And the reason why Pixar has to do so much preparation is because they're not amateurs. They have $1 million budgets and, of course, they're wasting a lot of money. But they're also wasting time and they're wasting energy. And when you think about it, that's exactly what we do when we sit down to write. We don't create that moment of preparation, or really that hour of preparation. And that's how you know the difference between an amateur and a professional. The amateur just sits down and begins to write. They sit at their computer and they decide, I'm going to write an article today. I'm going to create a podcast today. I'm going to create a webinar. The professional, on the other hand, sits down to plan. I was listening to a podcast earlier today, and there was this interview between Brian Orr and Jeff Brown. And Jeff worked in the radio industry for many, many years, and now he has his own podcast. And he was talking about how people just show up on podcast and they start to ask questions and they don't prepare, and how all the preparation is critical. And if you listen to Ira Glass on This American Life, and he's on videos on YouTube, and he talks about the preparation and how finding the stories takes like half the week, even though they have so many people in their staff. And we think, well, we're just business people. We just have to write an article. Let's sit down and write. And that's not how professionals work. You are a professional when you sit down to write, and therefore you have to sit down to plan. But what are you going to plan? Well, you've got to figure out what topic are you going to cover, what one word are you going to cover, what 3 subtopics you're going to cover, or at least how you're going to structure the article, how you're going to structure this podcast. When I sit down to do this podcast, most of the work is done outside. Now, admittedly, the music takes a lot of time, but the podcast takes only about 45 minutes to record, and it takes me an hour and a half to put all the details together, sometimes longer. I'll go to the cafe, I'll sit down, and I'll put it all together. And you can see a photograph of that. I'll put it in the show notes. And it takes a lot of preparation to create something that is more than average. And that's what professionals do. And this is the obstacle that we run into. And it's not like I don't try to beat the system. I try it. I'll show up here at 4 a.m. and I'll try to record a podcast, and then it's 4:30 and 4:45 and then 5:30, and it's very, very frustrating. And so I've given up. I've totally given up. Every time I want to record a podcast, I will go to the cafe and sit there and plan, and I don't have the time, and that's why I go, and that's why I plan, and this is what professionals do. They plan before they execute. They get the ingredients, put the biryani in the fridge, let it marinate, and then later they are cooking it. And amateurs, we just go there and we cook it right away, as if something magical is going to happen. So we've looked at 2 main obstacles, and the first one was editing, the fact that we get Captain Spock together instead of having Captain Kirk and Mr. Spock. And the second thing is this whole factor of preparation and how we want to bypass that process of marination. And this takes us to the third part, which is the one word or the one term. This podcast started with the story about Dick Fosbury. And you have to ask yourself, why did that story exist? What is the point of that story? The story was about obstacles and overcoming those obstacles. But why did the story matter? The story mattered because of that one word or one term. And in this case, the one term is a different perspective. So right until that moment in Mexico when Dick Fosbury sailed over the bar like a two-legged camel, well, there was only one perspective, and that perspective was to jump over it, straddle over it. And he went over in a completely different way. So the one term is about a different perspective, and that's how we looked at the entire article. We didn't go about how do we construct our article and what is the structure of the article, but we looked at things that stop us and we don't realize that they're stopping us, and that is editing and preparation and the one word. That one word or one term, which is different perspective, it allows me to do both the preparation and the editing. So when I'm preparing, I'm thinking of how can I have a different perspective on article writing? And then when I'm done and Mr. Editor has to show up, at that point in time, I'm going, did I do this? Did I actually adhere to the one word or one term? So in a way, the one word or one term satisfies the needs of those first two guys, which is preparation and editing. And it does so brilliantly. So when you're sitting down to write something, create something, ask yourself, what is the one thing that I want to convey here? What is that end point? And once you know the one word or one term, you will be able to communicate in a way that you've never communicated before. You'll be able to edit it in a way that you've never done before. Now, can it be more than one word or one term? Well, one term is a couple of words. Maybe you could stretch it to 3 words. The problem is that you may want to put in 3 words or 4 words or 5 words to describe your article, and the further away you go from one word, the more complicated it becomes. And it's very, very hard to then edit something or nail it down. So find one word. Ask yourself, what am I going to talk about today? Is it endeavor, or is it scarcity, or is it premium? The point is, once you get the one word and the one term, life becomes a lot simpler. And, that's really what we want. So that brings us to the end of this podcast. And what did we cover today? We covered 3 things. The first thing was the factor of editing, that the editor and the writer, they're 2 different people. And they show up at different times of day, probably on different days as well. So when you write and you edit on the same day, or write and edit, well, thank you. You're just frustrating yourself and driving yourself completely crazy. Do not edit. Come back another day. Do not become Captain Spock. The second thing is the preparation. The professionals, they don't sit down to write. They don't sit down to create, they sit down to plan. So you need to go away somewhere, plan, come back. Then you start to write. And if you have to learn how to write, well, you can deconstruct, say, this piece, because it's there in the show notes. You can deconstruct how it was created and then recreate it, or you can do an article writing course and learn how structure is built and how articles come together and how podcasts come together and how it's all based on structure. And once you understand the structure, it's just a matter of unfolding it like any language. And the third thing that we covered was one word. And the one word comes before you head out to the cafe, before you sit down to plan. It's, what am I going to cover today? What is that one thing that I want my audience to get? And once you know that, and you should know that, then it's very simple, or rather a lot simpler, to get to the end result. So what's the one thing that you can do today? The one thing that you should do today is just sit now and say, I'm going to write an article. What is the one word that I'm going to cover? And if you're not sure what you should do, I would suggest you go to the show notes and look at some of the links that I put there, and then deconstruct it and see how you can actually work out what one word was I trying to cover. And you'll start to see a pattern, and once you get that pattern, you will learn how to do it yourself. Of course, there's no substitute for being with a good teacher, and I am a good teacher, and you know that. And I'm going to be there live in Nashville, Tennessee, and then in Amsterdam, the Netherlands. And we're going to do a storytelling workshop. And I don't know if you noticed, but I'm sure you did. This podcast and every podcast is full of stories, and that's what keeps you going as you're walking, as you're driving. Suddenly, in the middle of all those facts and figures, there's the story unfolding. How does that story unfold? When you read the book, The Brain Audit, or you read the book on pricing, or you read the book on testimonials, when you read those books, you don't always know why you like the book so much. Sure, there's a structure, sure, there's a system, but more critically, there are case studies and examples and analogies and stories, and that's what keeps the progression going ahead. Because facts and figures, they're very good, but they're very tiring. And so storytelling becomes very critical. It's not only critical to get the message across in a meaningful way, but it's also very helpful to know how to construct stories so that your audience remembers them. Now, there are lots of storytelling books and there are lots of storytelling workshops. So why is this one going to be different? This one is different because this is storytelling versus storytelling. So when you open a book on storytelling, essentially they're teaching you how to write short stories, or they're telling you how to write a script or a movie. But very rarely are you going to get storytelling that helps you construct stuff for business, for writing articles, for adding to podcasts or seminars, or just about everything that you do in business. How do you connect it back to the business? How do you create books? How do you create reports? And how do you create them with stories embedded in them so they become irresistible? That's not what most workshops and books online are going to be able to teach you, and that's why this workshop is so critical. So come join us in Nashville on the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th of December, or if you're in Europe, it's the 15th, 16th, and 17th of December, and you can find everything at psychotactics.com/story-telling-workshop. Now the prices are going up. We always raise prices, and they're going to go up every 20 days or so. So by the time you get to it several months later, which is when the workshop begins, it'll be at its highest price. We are still in the early bird stages, so go to psychotactics.com/story-telling-workshop, and we'll see you there. If you haven't read The Brain Audit, you should read The Brain Audit. Why? Because it's one of the coolest business books you will ever read. It has lots of stories, and it's the barrier to the workshop. You have to read The Brain Audit before you get there. So either the workshop and The Brain Audit, or join us at 5000bc.com. That's it from me on a Friday evening, not a 4 a.m. So that's a little different. Bye for now. Still listening? I used to write articles before, and I would start writing the article and do what lots of people do, which is get midway to the article and then get completely lost. And I had what I'd call the article graveyard. And to this day, that article graveyard exists. There are probably 40 or 50 articles that never got completed. And that is one of the things that I find very important to do. The moment I get an idea, I will sit down and do an outline. And sometimes it's just on a Post-it. So I'll go to the cafe and I'll just borrow a Post-it and a pen, and I'll write down everything I can. Then of course I have to go to the second cafe, and flesh it out. So there's this complete story, and that really helps me. And over the years, I've got more and more dependent on this completion in the planning stage, really. And then I will come back and give it one go, and it's all done. And so today I don't have an article graveyard, but for a very long time, you could find me there with the ghosts of article writing.
That is illogical, Ensign. Odors cannot travel through the vacuum of space.